Chapter 1. France on the Eve of the Revolution. At the end of the 18th century, France found itself in a situation marked by deep contradictions. On the one hand, the country was the most populous in Europe, a center of culture, science, and the arts. Paris was considered the capital of the mind, where philosophers such as Voltaire, Montesquieu, and Rousseau had formulated their ideas. French fashion, literature, and architecture determined European taste. The court of Versailles under Louis XVI still radiated splendor to the outside world, and was reminiscent of the time of Louis XIV, the Sun King. On the other hand, the reality for the majority of the population was bleak. Poverty, social inequality, and a profound economic crisis shaped the lives of millions. French society was organized by the so-called class system, which was divided into three large groups. At the top was the first estate, the clergy. Although he made up only a very small part of the population in terms of numbers, estimated to be less than 1%, he enjoyed great privileges. The clergy received income from tithes, owned huge estates, and were exempt from many taxes. The second estate, the nobility, made up about 2% of the population. He also had considerable privileges. Nobles were usually exempt from direct taxes, they claimed duties and forced labor from peasants, and often held the best positions in the administration, army, and church. Finally, the third estate, which comprised around 97% of the population, was excluded from these privileges. It included farmers, craftsmen, workers, but also the wealthy middle class, the bourgeoisie. It was precisely these wealthier members of the Third Estate who increasingly found it unbearable to remain politically and socially excluded, even though they had considerable influence through trade, science, or crafts. The economic foundation of France was extremely fragile in the late 18th century. The state was heavily indebted, not least due to expensive wars, including the 7 Years' War and the support of the American colonies in the War of Independence against England. The expenses of the court in Versailles, with its festivals, buildings, and pensions, placed an additional burden on the state treasury. Attempts to reform the tax system and curtail the privileges of the nobility failed due to the resistance of those who had the most to lose. So the burden of taxes remained on the shoulders of the ordinary population. In addition, there was a demographic and agrarian crisis. In the years before 1789, there were crop failures, which caused the price of bread to skyrocket. Since bread was the main food for the majority of people, rising prices led to hunger and discontent. Peasants and urban lower classes suffered equally, while at the same time they were supposed to pay higher taxes. Economic hardship increased resentment over social inequality. But the causes of the crisis were not only in the economy and society, but also in the area of ideas. The Enlightenment had changed France and Europe. Philosophers such as Rousseau called for equality. Montesquieu emphasized the separation of powers. Voltaire fought against superstition and church paternalism. Her writings circulated far beyond the salons of the elite. They were read by an educated middle class that began to question the existing system. Terms such as freedom, civil rights, and popular sovereignty gained weight and called into question the foundation of the absolutist monarchy. The experience of the American Revolution also acted as an inspiration. Many French officers, including the Marquis de Lafayette, had fought for independence in America and brought the ideas of freedom and self-determination with them to Europe. The fact that a colony had been able to successfully assert itself against a great power was a signal. Change was possible. Louis XVI was not personally a tyrant. Contemporaries described him as good-natured but indecisive, dutiful but weak. He was not a despot like Louis XIV, but rather a man who had difficulty making clear decisions. His wife, Marie Antoinette, daughter of the Austrian Empress Maria Theresa, soon became a symbol of waste and decadence among the people. Their alleged statement, "If they have no bread, let them eat cake," even if it is historically dubious, reflects the perception that the court had lost touch with reality. Against this background, French society was a powder keg on the eve of the revolution. The rigid structures of the class system no longer fit into a world in which new ideas of freedom and equality circulated. The economic crisis made the injustices even more visible, while the royal family was unable to implement reforms. The Third Estate, which made up the vast majority, had become aware of its numerical strength and was no longer willing to accept the old privileges. Paris itself was a focal point of unrest. The city was the center of trade, crafts, and intellectual life. This is where rumors, pamphlets, and speeches converged, where protests were raised, where the first revolutionary movements were formed. At the same time, Paris was a city full of poverty, where hunger and discontent were even more noticeable than in the countryside. The years before 1789 were thus marked by a mixture of hope and despair. Hope because new ideas were in the air that made people feel that change was possible. Despair because everyday life was dominated by hardship and inequality. In this tension between tradition and modernity, between poverty and splendor, between stagnation and new beginnings, the moment ripened when France was to experience one of the most profound upheavals in its history. The French Revolution was not a sudden outbreak, but the result of a long development. But on the eve, in 1788, the land was like a taut bow, whose string was just waiting to be loosened. The next few years were to show how powerful the forces that had accumulated in France were, and how much they would change not only his own country, but the whole world. Chapter 2: Causes, Economy, Society. To understand the French Revolution, one must look at its deeper causes. They were not only due to the events of 1789, but to a network of economic, social, and ideological tensions that had built up over decades. In the late 18th century, France was in a state in which the old structures of the monarchy and the corporative state were no longer compatible with the new realities and expectations of society. The country's economic problems were immense. France was an agrarian state, and the vast majority of the population lived from agriculture. But agricultural production was heavily dependent on weather, harvests, and traditional farming methods. Poor harvests in 1787 and 1788 led to dramatic price increases for grain, which formed the basis of bread, the most important food for the population. While prices rose, wages remained low. Many families spent up to 80% of their income on bread alone. Hunger and hardships spread and created an explosive atmosphere. The state was also in a precarious financial situation. For decades, the monarchy had accumulated enormous debts, not least through expensive wars. The 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, had been a disaster for France. It lost Canada and other colonies to Great Britain. To make up for this loss of prestige, Louis XVI supported the American colonies in the War of Independence against England. Although this was a political success, it put a heavy burden on the state treasury. The cost of weapons, equipment, and military expeditions drove France deeper into debt. Attempts to restructure the finances have repeatedly failed due to resistance from the privileged classes. Finance ministers such as Turgot and Necker recognized that the tax burden had to be distributed more fairly. They also wanted to make the nobility and clergy pay more, but they defended themselves with all means. Since they had a strong influence in the Parlement, the supreme courts that had to approve reforms, they blocked any fundamental change. So the main burden of taxes remained with the Third Estate, i.e., with those who could bear the least anyway. Social tensions exacerbated the crisis. France was still characterized by the class system, a relic of the Middle Ages. The First Estate, clergy, and the Second Estate, nobility, enjoyed numerous privileges. They were largely exempt from taxes and had land, influence, and prestige. The Third Estate, on the other hand, the vast majority, had hardly any rights, although it was becoming increasingly important both economically and intellectually. There were great differences within the Third Estate. Farmers and agricultural workers made up the largest part. Many of them were poor, in debt, and crushed by taxes. At the same time, however, the urban bourgeoisie grew. Merchants, craftsmen, lawyers, doctors, civil servants. This class had education, prosperity, and self-confidence, but no political power. She felt set back by the privileges of the nobility. This discrepancy between economic reality and political structure was one of the central causes of the revolution. In addition to the economic and social factors, the intellectual movement of the Enlightenment also played a decisive role. Philosophers such as Montesquieu, Voltaire, and Rousseau questioned the foundations of the absolute monarchy. Montesquieu demanded a separation of powers that would deprive the king of his unlimited power. Voltaire fought against the power of the church and demanded tolerance and freedom of thought. Rousseau went even further. In his Contrat social, social contract, he declared that true sovereignty lies with the people, not with the king. These ideas were discussed in salons, coffee houses, and over pamphlets, and shaped an entire generation of intellectuals and citizens. The American Revolution also acted as a catalyst. The success of the colonies that had broken away from the British Crown showed that it was possible to build a new political system on the principles of freedom and equality. French officers like Lafayette, who had fought in America, brought back not only practical experience but also the spirit of the revolution. The crisis of the monarchy intensified these developments. Louis XVI was not a cruel tyrant, but a weak, hesitant king. He wanted reforms, but he did not have the determination to push them through against the resistance of the privileged. His wife, Marie Antoinette, became a projection screen for popular anger. It stood for waste, decadence, and the distance of the farm from the everyday life of ordinary people. Whether she was really as wasteful as her opponents claimed was irrelevant. What mattered was the image people had of her. All these factors led to a deep crisis of legitimacy of the system. The old France, the Ancien Régime, had become contradictory in itself. On the one hand, it held on to feudal structures. On the other hand, society had long been permeated by new ideas and forces. Farmers demanded relief, civil rights gained importance, intellectuals propagated freedom and equality. The monarchy was incapable of doing justice to these contradictions. When Louis XVI finally convened the Estates General in May 1789, it was an attempt to solve the crisis and at the same time the beginning of the end. For in this assembly, the contradictions became openly apparent. The Third Estate was no longer willing to subordinate itself. The causes of the revolution had condensed into a storm that was soon to sweep the whole country. Chapter 3: The Crisis of the Monarchy. The crisis of the French monarchy was not only a financial imbalance, but a comprehensive loss of confidence in the entire system of the Ancien Régime. By the end of the 18th century, royalty, which had been considered sacrosanct for centuries, had found itself in a situation where it could hardly maintain its authority. Louis XVI was at the center of this development, a king who had inherited the claim of absolute rule but was unable to live up to it either in practice or in his personality. The causes of this crisis were manifold. First and foremost was the national debt. France had invested enormous sums in wars in recent decades. The 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, ended in a humiliating defeat by England, which not only damaged the prestige of the monarchy, but also caused high costs. Hardly recovered, France threw itself into supporting the American colonies in the War of Independence against Great Britain. Although this brought the French satisfaction over their rival England, the price was enormous. Billions of livres flowed into weapons, equipment, and troops. The tax system was in no way suitable to bear this burden. While farmers, craftsmen, and citizens had to pay a large part of their income in direct and indirect taxes, the nobility and clergy were largely spared. The Crown's attempts to make the privileged more accountable regularly failed. Thus, ordinary people were faced with the paradoxical situation that they not only had to pay for their own misery, but also bore the debts of a wasteful state. This financial misery could still have been solved by decisive reforms, but it was precisely here that Louis XVI's weakness became apparent. His predecessors had already repeatedly appointed finance ministers who proposed reforms. Turgot wanted to dissolve the guilds and abolish the corvée, the forced labor of the peasants. Necker relied on transparency by disclosing the finances for the first time, a step that made him popular with the people but hated by the court. Calonne, in turn, tried to introduce a comprehensive tax reform that would also cover the nobility and clergy. All these approaches failed because they called into question the basic structure of privileges. The situation became particularly dramatic when Louis XVI convened the Assembly of Notables in 1787, a group of high-ranking nobles and clergymen that was supposed to bless reforms. Instead, they blocked the king's proposals. This made it clear that even in times of greatest crisis, the privileged estates were not prepared to give up their advantages. The power of the king, who was considered the absolute ruler, came up against the limits of a society that was deeply encrusted in its structures. In addition to the financial crisis, there was a political crisis. The institutions of the Ancien Régime were no longer able to create trust. The parliaments, which functioned as supreme courts, presented themselves as a bastion of privileges. They blocked royal edicts and stylized themselves as defenders of freedom, but only their own, not that of the people. So it happened that the population, which was actually suffering under the power of the king, suddenly saw allies in the parliaments. This further weakened the authority of the crown. In addition, there was Louis XVI's personal weakness. He was not a cruel despot, but he lacked assertiveness and political skill. Contemporaries described him as reserved, insecure, and hesitant. His passion was more hunting and castle mechanics than state leadership. These traits might not have meant disaster in calmer times, but in an era that demanded decisive reforms, they proved fatal. Marie Antoinette's role should not be underestimated in this context either. The queen, who came from the House of Habsburg, was unpopular from the beginning. She was considered a stranger, a wasteful woman, and a symbol of the decadence of the court. Her love of luxury, fashion, and celebrations was exploited in countless pamphlets. Whether these representations always corresponded to the truth was beside the point. The decisive factor was that in the eyes of the people, they provided proof of how detached the court lived. Public opinion, a phenomenon that gained more and more weight through the dissemination of pamphlets, newspapers, and coffeehouse discussions, developed into an invisible but powerful opponent of the monarchy. The crisis of the monarchy was therefore more than a financial problem. It was a crisis of legitimacy. The monarchy had lost its moral authority because it was no longer able to perform the most elementary tasks, to ensure justice, to alleviate hunger, and to ensure stability. Instead, it appeared as an institution that was defending its own privileges and had lost touch with the people. In 1788, the crisis reached its peak. Another bad harvest caused bread prices to explode. There were hunger riots in the cities and uprisings against the tax burden in the countryside. At the same time, the state treasury was empty. The king had only one option: to convene the Estates General, an assembly that had not met since 1614. With this step, he opened Pandora's box. What was intended as a means of restructuring finances was to become a forum in which the entire system of the Ancien Régime was questioned. The crisis of the monarchy was thus not an isolated event, but the result of decades of development. It showed the inability of the system to adapt to changing conditions. France was on the verge of a coup that no one could stop.
Chapter 4. The beginning of 1789. Estates General and Ballhouse Oath. When Louis XVI convened the Estates General in 1789, he had little idea that he was setting the decisive ball rolling that would sweep away old France. The Estates General were an institution that had last met in 1614 and were therefore already a relic of bygone times for many. The fact that they were now convened again after almost 175 years showed how desperate the situation of the monarchy had become. The reason was the catastrophic financial situation. The state treasury was empty, creditors were pressing, bread prices were rising immeasurably. Louis XVI and his advisors saw the Estates General as an instrument for enforcing new taxes and obtaining the consent of the nation. But while the king saw the Estates General as a tool for restructuring, many subjects saw this as a historic opportunity to fundamentally address the country's grievances. The Estates General were traditionally composed of the representatives of the three estates: the clergy, the nobility, and the third estate. Each class elected its deputies and wrote so-called cahiers de doléances, complaint booklets in which the grievances were listed and demands were formulated. These notebooks are still a fascinating source today because they paint a vivid picture of how people saw their world on the eve of the Revolution. They ranged from complaints about high taxes and unjust levies to demands for more rights, equality before the law, and a limitation of royal power. Especially in the Third Estate, an explosive mixture accumulated. He made up around 97% of the population, but received only a third of the votes in the traditional distribution of votes. Since each of the three groups, nobility, clergy, third estate, had one vote each, the nobility and clergy could outvote the third estate even if it was far superior in numbers. Even before the convocation, it was clear that this procedure would meet with massive resistance. On May 5, 1789, the deputies gathered in Versailles. The pompous opening ceremony once again showed the distance between court and people. While the king and the aristocracy appeared in magnificent robes, the representatives of the third estate appeared modest. From the beginning, the atmosphere was tense. The third estate demanded that the votes should not be carried out according to estates, but according to heads, a demand that, if it had been fulfilled, would have made the preponderance of the people visible for the first time. When this demand was rejected, the third estate decided to take a radical step. On 17 June 1789, its deputies declared themselves the National Assembly. In doing so, they claimed to represent the French people alone and no longer be bound by the old structures. This step was revolutionary because it deprived the king and the privileged estates of their monopoly on political legitimacy. A few days later, there was a symbolic scene that was to go down in history: the Ballhouse Oath, Serment de Jeu de Paume. Since the meeting hall of the Third Estate was suddenly locked, presumably by order of the king, the deputies met on 20 June 1789 in a nearby ballroom. There, they swore not to part until France had received a constitution. This oath was an act of unprecedented determination. It showed that the deputies were ready to take the conflict with the monarchy to the extreme. The Ballhouse Oath soon became a founding myth of the revolution. The images and depictions of this scene showed the will of the people to no longer allow themselves to be patronized. Some representatives of the nobility and clergy also joined the National Assembly. This increased their legitimacy, and Louis XVI found himself forced into a defensive position. The king's reaction was contradictory. At first, he tried to declare the new National Assembly illegal. But when he noticed that more and more parliament were defecting and that the people supported the movement, he felt compelled to give in. On June 27, he ordered the nobility and clergy to join the National Assembly. What had begun as an assembly of the Estates General had now become a national representation of the people. This had fundamentally changed France's political landscape. The National Assembly was the expression of a new principle, that the source of sovereignty was not birth or tradition, but the people. This idea, which had previously been discussed mainly in the writings of philosophers such as Rousseau, had now taken concrete shape. But the events of 1789 were only the beginning. The Ballhouse Oath was a promise that was soon to be fulfilled through deeds. The mood in the country was tense, the rumor mill was bubbling over, and people were waiting for the next step. It was as if the floodgates had been opened. The revolution could no longer be stopped.
Chapter 5. The Storming of the Bastille. July 14, 1789 marks one of the most famous days in world history, the storming of the Bastille. This event became not only a symbol of the French Revolution, but also a symbol of the overthrow of the old order in general. Viewed soberly, the Bastille was neither a strategically important base nor a particularly heavily occupied prison. Its significance lay in what it embodied: the arbitrary rule of the king, the oppression of absolutism, and the fear of state power. The weeks leading up to this day were marked by growing tension. After the Ballhouse Oath and the founding of the National Assembly, the revolution had its institutional beginning. But the people, especially in Paris, were driven by hunger, unemployment, and rising bread prices. The failed harvests of the previous year had dramatically worsened the supply situation. Rumors of speculators holding back grain to drive up prices made the rounds. Distrust of the court and nobility grew. The situation came to a head at the beginning of July when Louis XVI dismissed the popular finance minister Necker. Necker was a beacon of hope for many French people because he had called for transparency and proposed reforms. His dismissal was seen as a sign that the king would abandon the path of reform and instead rely on repression. Open indignation broke out in Paris. Thousands of people poured into the streets. Speakers heated up the atmosphere, and the demand for weapons became louder and louder. On July 12, mass demonstrations took place. A young lawyer, Camille Desmoulins, jumped on a table in the Palais Royal and called on the crowd to arm themselves and fight for freedom. His words electrified the audience. People tore branches from trees, decorated themselves with green leaves, a symbol of hope, and paraded through the streets. Soon, looting of weapons depots followed, and the city came to the brink of uprising. 2 days later, on July 14th, the anger was directed at the Bastille. This old fortress from the Middle Ages has long been a symbol of royal despotism. Here, people were incarcerated without trial, often on the mere order of the king, through so-called lettres de cachette. Even though there were only 7 prisoners left in the Bastille in 1789, the building was an object of hatred for the Parisian population. The crowd gathered in front of the Bastille and demanded weapons and ammunition that were stored there. The governor, Bernard René de Launay, initially tried to negotiate, but soon the situation escalated. Shots were fired, and the crowd stormed the gate. Hours of fighting followed, supported by deserted soldiers who joined the insurgents. In the end, Launay had to capitulate. The storming ended in violence. The governor was captured and beaten to death by the angry crowd on the way to the Hôtel de Ville. His head was carried through the streets on a pike, an image that burned itself deeply into the memory of the revolution. The Bastille was systematically demolished in the days that followed, stone by stone, as if the old system were literally to be dismantled into its component parts. The significance of this day went far beyond the practical use. With the storming of the Bastille, the people showed that they were a political power that could no longer be ignored. The revolution was no longer just a dispute between estates or a discussion in assemblies. It had become a people's movement. July 14, 1789 was the moment when the revolution was visibly carried into the streets. The news spread like wildfire throughout the country and even beyond. In the provinces, where people were also plagued by poverty, enthusiasm was rampant. Peasants began to storm the castles of the lords, burn documents about taxes, and free themselves from the old order. This wave of turmoil went down in history as the Great Fear, La Grande Peur. The storming of the Bastille also caused an international sensation. Throughout Europe, princes and kings looked on in horror at the events in Paris. The Bastille was more than a prison, it was a symbol of the power of the monarchy. Her case became proof that even seemingly untouchable institutions could be overthrown. Revolutionaries in other countries saw it as an inspiration, while the rulers saw it as an ominous warning. For Louis XVI, the storming of the Bastille was a shock. On the evening of July 14th, he is said to have made an entry in his hunting diary. Rien, nothing. He had made no booty that day, but the events in Paris showed that there was something much greater to lose during his reign. The next day he asked his court, "Is this a revolt?" The Duke of La Rochefoucauld answered, "No, sire, this is a revolution." From now on, it was clear that the monarchy could not simply continue as before. The storming of the Bastille had irrevocably changed the balance of power. The people had awakened, and the revolution could no longer be stopped.
Chapter 6. The Declaration of Human and Civil Rights. After the storming of the Bastille in July 1789, the revolution was no longer just an uprising against bread prices or a spontaneous act of rage. It had taken on a political and ideological dimension. The people had shown that they were a power that could determine the course of history. But this raised the question, what principles should the new France be built on? The revolutionaries gave the answer in a document that is still one of the most important political texts in the world today, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, Déclaration des droits de l'homme et du citoyen. The declaration was written in the summer of 1789, in a climate of hope, uncertainty, and upheaval. The National Assembly had constituted itself in June as the representative of the people, saw the Bastille fall in July, and was now faced with the task of formulating the foundations of a new order. The old state, the Ancien Régime, was shaken, but not yet completely eliminated. The revolutionaries wanted to codify their principles in order to give direction and legitimacy to the political process. The inspiration came from several sources.
On the one hand, there was the philosophy of the Enlightenment. Rousseau, Montesquieu, and Voltaire had brought the ideas of freedom, equality, and popular sovereignty into the world. On the other hand, the American Revolution played a role. The American Declaration of Independence of 1776 and the Bill of Rights of the States were examples of how universal rights could be translated into political documents. French officers like Lafayette, who had fought in America, brought these experiences back to Europe. On 26 August 1789, the National Assembly finally adopted the Declaration. It consisted of 17 articles and was not intended as a complete constitution, but as a basic text that laid down the rights of all citizens. The language was deliberately kept general and pathetic so that it could seem timeless. The first article formulated a radical message. People are born free and equal on rights and remain so. This dissolved the foundation of the Estates Society. Privileges based solely on birth or status should no longer be valid. It was a rejection of centuries of feudal order. Other articles emphasized central principles of modern democracy: freedom of opinion and the press, equality before the law, presumption of innocence in criminal law. The idea of popular sovereignty was particularly important. Article 3 declared that the source of all sovereignty lies with the people. It was no longer the king, not God, but the community of citizens who was the bearer of political power. Property was also enshrined as an inviolable right. Article 17 described property as a sacred and inviolable right. In this way, the revolution was associated not only with civil liberties, but also with a new definition of economic order. Property was no longer a privilege of the nobility, but a general right to which every citizen was entitled to. The Declaration had a double effect. Internally, it gave the French a common foundation. Millions of people who had previously been subjects now became citizens. They were bearers of rights that were not conferred on them by a ruler, but that they were entitled to by nature. This fundamentally changed the self-image of the individual and society. To the outside world, the Declaration became a signal to the world. It has been translated into many languages and inspired movements in Europe and Latin America. Revolutionaries saw this as proof that universal human rights were not abstract dreams, but could become concrete political reality. But as groundbreaking as the Declaration was, it also showed its limits. She spoke of people and citizens, but in practice, she meant mainly men. Women were excluded from political life. Their rights were not recognized, which led to protests. Olympe de Gouges, for example, published her Declaration of the Rights of Woman and Citizen in 1791, in which she called for gender equality. But this voice was ignored by those in power, and de Gouges would later end up on the scaffold. The question of slavery also remained unresolved. While the Declaration postulated universal rights, the reality in the colonies remained different. Hundreds of thousands of slaves in the French possessions of the Caribbean continued to live under brutal oppression. It was not until the 1790s, in the course of the Haitian Revolution, that this contradiction became openly visible. Last but not least, the role of the king also remained unclear. The Declaration spoke of the rights of the people, but the monarchy continued to exist. Louis XVI had lost his authority, but he was still on the throne. The coming months were to show how difficult it was to translate the principles of the Declaration into political reality. Despite these limitations, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen was an epochal step. It marked the break with the old order and laid the foundation for modern democracy. Her sentences, formulated simply and clearly, resonate to this day. The preamble stated that ignorance, forgetting, or disregard for human rights were the only causes of public misfortune. With this message, the revolution placed not only France, but all of humanity on a new footing. The summer of 1789 had thus not only produced barricades and uprisings, but also a document that translated the ideas of the Enlightenment into political action. However, the road was still long and full of contradictions. For as much as the Declaration was a manifesto of universal rights, its implementation was to provoke countless conflicts, struggles, and tragedies in the years to come.
Chapter 7. The Upheaval in the Countryside, La Grande Père. While Paris was the center of the revolution in the summer of 1789, the country was not untouched, for the revolution was not a purely urban movement. In villages, in the fields, and in the provinces, a wave of unrest began to spread, which would later be called La Grande Peur, the Great Fear. It was a mixture of rumors, panic, and spontaneous uprisings that shook the old feudal system to its foundations. The causes of this movement lay deep in the social and economic realities of French rural life. The peasants made up the majority of the population, and they were the ones who bore the burden of taxes and duties the heaviest. In addition to the royal taxes, they had to pay tithes to the church and pay taxes to their landlords. In addition, there was forced labor, i.e., forced labor that farmers had to do for their masters, whether it was road construction, harvesting, or repairs. Many of these duties had become symbols of oppression over the centuries. When the news of the events in Paris, the Ballhouse Oath, the storming of the Bastille, and the declaration of the National Assembly reached the country, a feeling spread that a new era had dawned, but this feeling was mixed with fear. Rumors circulated that nobles were hiring mercenaries to crush the revolution, or that marauding gangs were on the move to plunder villages. In a society characterized by oral narratives and few information channels, such rumors had an enormous impact. In July and August 1789, there was a wave of uprisings in the provinces. Farmers armed themselves with scythes, pitchforks, and old rifles. They plundered castles, set fire to archives in which the tax and feudal rights were recorded, and forced nobles to sign waivers for them. Often, it was less hatred of individual lords than the desire to end the system of feudal burdens once and for all. With every document burned, a piece of the old order fell. The Great Fear was chaotic, decentralized, and not centrally controlled, but it was of enormous symbolic importance. It showed that the revolution was not limited to the cities, but also spread to the countryside. Millions of farmers became actors who changed society from the bottom up. The National Assembly in Paris was alarmed. On the one hand, she saw the uprisings as a threat to order. On the other hand, it recognized that the demands of the peasants were justified and that their energy could be used for the revolution. In a dramatic session on the night of 4 to 5 August 1789, the deputies decided to abolish the feudal burdens. Nobles, clerics, and citizens symbolically relinquished their privileges. It was a moment of pathetic grandeur. The old system of taxes, forced labor, and special rights was officially ended. Of course, the reality was more complicated. Many taxes should not be abolished immediately, but only against compensation. Nevertheless, the decision was a decisive break. It showed that the National Assembly was ready to meet the demands of the people and abolish the Ancien Régime not only in Paris, but throughout the country. The Great Fear was thus an engine of the revolution. Without the pressure of the farmers, the radical decision of the night of August 4th might not have taken place. It made it clear that the revolution was not only supported by intellectuals, lawyers, or urban insurgents, but also by ordinary people in the countryside. At the same time, the movement revealed the deep social tensions that shaped France. In some regions, acts of violence occurred, nobles fled or were threatened, and the old structures disintegrated faster than the National Assembly could create new rules. The country was on the move, and uncertainty shaped everyday life. But the Great Fear also had a psychological effect. It showed that the peasants were no longer subjects, but citizens who could take their fate into their own hands. This change in self-image was perhaps the most profound consequence of the revolution in the countryside. This made the summer of 1789 a double turning point. The Bastille fell in Paris, and the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen was passed. In the countryside, on the other hand, the Great Fear destroyed the foundation of the feudal system. Together, these events marked the end of the Ancien Régime and the beginning of a new social order.
Chapter 8. The Constitutional Monarchy. After the dramatic events of the summer of 1789, the storming of the Bastille, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, and the uprisings of the Great Fear, France was faced with a new task: the attempt to create a stable political order. The National Assembly had de facto abolished the Ancien Régime, but the question of what the new system should look like remained open. Many revolutionaries envisioned a France that would continue to be a monarchy, but no longer absolutist, but limited by a constitution,
a constitutional monarchy modeled on England. Louis XVI played a central role in these plans. The king was weakened, but still on the throne. Many deputies, especially from the moderate majority, did not want to overthrow him, but wanted to integrate him into the new order. They believed that a monarchy without absolute power could be a guarantor of stability. In this view, the king continued to be the head of the state, but his authority was to be limited by laws and popular representations. The months after the summer of 1789 were marked by work on a constitution. Lawyers, philosophers, and politicians passionately discussed principles such as the separation of powers, sovereignty, and civil rights. It was agreed that the legislature, i.e. the right to legislate, should be in the hands of an elected National Assembly. The king was given a veto right, but only a suspensive one, which could temporarily block laws but not prevent them definitively. On the one hand, this was intended to preserve his dignity, and on the other hand, to ensure the supremacy of the people. At the same time, the administration of the state had to be reorganized. France has so far been a patchwork of provinces, dioceses, and feudal lordships. Now the country was divided into 83 equal departments, which were structured independently of old borders and traditions. This reorganization was a radical break because it destroyed centuries-old structures and created a modern administration that still exists in France today. The church also came into the sights of the revolutionaries. In November 1789, the National Assembly decided to nationalize the church's property in order to alleviate the financial crisis. The goods of the monasteries and bishoprics were to be sold, and the revenues served as the basis for a new paper currency, the so-called assignats. At the same time, the civil constitution of the clergy was passed in 1790, which made clergymen state officials elected by the people and paid by the state. Priests and bishops had to swear an oath to the nation. This step deeply divided the country. Many clergymen refused to take the oath and became opponents of the revolution. In rural regions, where the Catholic faith was firmly anchored, this led to tensions that were to escalate into open conflicts in the coming years. However, hopes for a constitutional monarchy were soon put to the test. The king himself was dissatisfied with his new role. Louis XVI felt disempowered. His wife, Marie Antoinette, urged him to take action against the revolution, and nobles who had fled abroad demanded a return to the old order. The National Assembly mistrusted the king, but many deputies clung to the idea that he was indispensable for the success of the new order. In October 1789, another decisive event occurred, the women's procession to Versailles. Thousands of Parisian women, suffering from rising bread prices, marched to Versailles to demand bread and support from the king. They invaded the castle, forced the king to move to Paris, and thus made him a de facto prisoner of the people. From then on, Louis XVI lived in the Tuileries Palace, in the immediate vicinity of the National Assembly and under the eyes of the Parisian population. Despite all the difficulties, work on the Constitution progressed. In 1791, the National Assembly finally adopted the new Constitution. It declared France a constitutional monarchy, in which the king remained the head of state, but the real power lay with the Legislative Assembly. All male citizens who could show a certain tax revenue were given the right to vote, a restriction that many felt was insufficient, as it excluded large parts of the poorer population. The promulgation of the Constitution was a solemn moment. It was hoped that an era of stability would now begin. But the reality was different. The king had never inwardly resigned himself to the new order. In June 1791, he and his family tried to flee Paris in order to ally themselves with foreign allies, the famous flight to Varennes. Although he was caught on the run and brought back, the trust was finally destroyed. From then on, many French people no longer regarded the king as a partner, but as a traitor. The constitutional monarchy was thus unstable from the beginning. It was a compromise that sought to combine the old institution of the monarchy with the new principles of the revolution. But the tensions between these two poles proved to be irreconcilable. The experiment lasted barely a year before it was swept away by the radicalization of the revolution. And yet, this phase remains important. It shows that the revolution did not have the overthrow of the king and the republic as its goal from the beginning. Many revolutionaries initially wanted only reforms, not total upheaval. It was only the failure of the constitutional monarchy that led to the republic appearing to be the only solution.
Chapter 9: Radicalization of the Revolution. The years 1791 and 1792 marked a decisive turning point in the French Revolution. What had begun in 1789 as a reform movement that wanted to integrate the king into a constitutional order increasingly developed into a radical restructuring of state and society. The hope of reconciling the monarchy and the revolution gave way to mistrust, anger, and finally the call for a republic. A central trigger for this radicalization was the aforementioned flight of the king to Varennes in June 1791, when Louis XVI had tried to escape from Paris with his family in order to join troops of loyal officers and possibly foreign powers in the east of the country. But the escape failed. The king was recognized, arrested, and brought back to Paris. This event deeply shook confidence in the monarchy. Many French people now saw confirmation that Louis was not on the side of the nation, but supported its enemies. At the same time, social tensions in Paris intensified. The economic crisis remained unresolved. Bread prices rose again, unemployment was rampant, and the anger of the common people, the so-called sans-culottes, grew. These urban masses, named for their long trousers as opposed to the knee breeches of the nobility, became a driving force of radicalization. They demanded not only political participation, but also social justice, cheaper food, fair wages, and a tough stance against traitors. The international situation also contributed to the escalation. Many nobles had fled abroad and intrigued against the revolution from there. The kings and princes of Europe watched the events in France with growing concern. They feared that the revolutionary ideas could also spill over into their countries. In August 1791, the Austrian Emperor Leopold II and the Prussian King Frederick William II declared in the so-called Pillnitz Declaration that they were prepared to intervene militarily if necessary to save the French monarchy. Although this explanation was rather vague, it caused panic in France. The National Assembly was faced with a dilemma. On the one hand, it wanted to defend the revolution, but on the other hand, France lacked the means for war. Nevertheless, the conviction grew that the threats had to be faced. Under pressure from radical deputies such as Brissot and the Girondins, France declared war on Austria in April 1792. This step was intended to strengthen the revolution, but initially led to chaos. The army was poorly equipped, many officers deserted, and the first campaigns ended in defeat. The fear of betrayal took over in Paris. The king and queen were suspected of secretly cooperating with the enemies. Marie Antoinette, the Austrian woman, was particularly hated. In the streets, pamphlets and newspapers spread wild rumors of intrigue, luxury, and betrayal of the people. On August 10, 1792, radicalization reached a peak. A large crowd of sans-culottes, supported by National Guardsmen, stormed the Tuileries, the royal palace in Paris. Louis XVI and his family fled to the National Assembly, but the monarchy was effectively at an end. The king was suspended and imprisoned, and power now lay with the popular masses and the more radical forces within the revolution. The following period was marked by violence and insecurity. In September 1792, the notorious September massacres took place. Revolutionaries stormed prisons and murdered hundreds of inmates, including many clergymen and nobles. The fear of a counter-revolution, fueled by the war against Prussia and Austria, erupted in brutal violence. These massacres showed that the revolution had reached a new stage, one in which terror and bloodshed were increasingly seen as legitimate means. With the proclamation of the Republic on 21 September 1792, the break with the monarchy was final. The new National Convention declared that France was henceforth a republic, in which the people had sole sovereignty. This meant that the idea of a constitutional monarchy had failed. Radicalization had led the country into a completely new political order. But the Republic was under pressure from the beginning. External enemies threatened them militarily, internal opponents organized themselves, and the population expected solutions to hunger, poverty, and social justice. In this situation, new political currents would to prevail that were prepared to defend the revolution by all means, even at the price of terror and violence.
Chapter 10: The escape to Varennes and its consequences. The king's flight to Varennes in June 1791 is one of the key moments of the French Revolution. Hardly any other event has destroyed the relationship between the people and the monarchy so lastingly. What until then could have appeared to be a joint project between king and nation revealed itself after that night as an irreconcilable contradiction. Ludwig XVI had never resigned himself to the role of constitutional monarch. Since the National Assembly abolished the privileges in 1789 and passed the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, he felt increasingly disempowered. He was particularly repelled by the civil constitution of the clergy of 1790, which made clergymen state officials, as he saw himself deeply rooted in his faith. His wife, Marie Antoinette, also despised the revolution and urged her husband to no longer remain passive. So the plan to leave Paris matured in the royal entourage. The destination was the town of Montmédy near the border with the Austrian Netherlands, where loyal regiments were stationed. From there, Ludwig hoped to steer the revolution in a direction that was more favorable to him, whether through negotiations with the National Assembly or with the help of foreign intervention. In the night of 20 to 21 June 1791, the escape began. The royal family disguised themselves and climbed into a large carriage that was to take them through several stations towards the northeast. But even the dimension of the escape was a problem. The heavy, conspicuous carriage attracted attention, and the journey went slower than planned. There were several delays so that the carefully coordinated schedule collapsed. The fate of the escape was decided in the small town of Varennes. There, a postmaster recognized the king. Ludwig's moves were all too familiar from coins and pictures. He immediately alerted the local authorities. The family was stopped and forced to turn back under increasing pressure from the population. On June 25, the train reached Paris, escorted by National Guardsmen and under the suspicious gaze of thousands of citizens. The king's return was a political earthquake. There was dead silence in the streets as the carriage passed, a silent sign that trust had been broken. From now on, many no longer saw Louis as a king who could put himself at the head of the revolution, but as a traitor who was willing to leave his people and confront them with foreign powers. The National Assembly was faced with a delicate situation. On the one hand, it was clear that the king rejected the revolution. On the other hand, they did not want to overthrow the monarchy immediately because they feared radicalization and instability. So a compromise was decided. It was declared that Ludwig had been kidnapped and had not made the escape of his own volition. This official version was supposed to save the monarchy, but it hardly convinced anyone. The people had seen what had happened. The consequences of the flight to Varennes were profound. Politically, it led to the emergence of a new opposition, the Republicans. Until then, only a few voices had called for the overthrow of the king. But after Varennes, the conviction grew that a constitutional monarchy could not work. The Jacobins, who developed from a moderate debating society into a radical political force, gained influence. Pamphlets and speakers increasingly openly demanded the abolition of the crown. Social tensions further exacerbated the situation. The people, especially the sans-culottes in Paris, felt betrayed. Hunger and unemployment continued to shape everyday life, and the king now appeared as a symbol of betrayal and injustice. The demands for his removal became louder. The flight also had international consequences. In the European monarchies, it increased the fear that the revolution could get out of control. Marie Antoinette was the sister of the Austrian Emperor Leopold II, who came under increasing pressure to intervene. This brought the danger of a European war closer, which was to radicalize the revolution even further. The events of Varennes therefore mark a turning point. They destroyed the last remnant of confidence in the monarchy and gave the revolution a new direction. A reform project turned into a fight for the republic. The king, who was originally supposed to embody the unity of the state, had now become a liability. In retrospect, it becomes clear that the flight to Varennes was perhaps Ludwig XVI's decisive mistake. If he had persevered in Paris and come to terms with the reforms, the monarchy might have been saved, albeit in a very limited form. But his attempt to evade the will of the people finally made him an opponent of the revolution.
Chapter 11. War and Revolution, 1792. The year 1792 was a decisive turning point in the French Revolution.
By then, the movement had evolved from a reform of the monarchy to an increasingly radical transformation. However, with France's entry into the war against the European monarchies, the revolution reached a new dimension. It no longer became just an internal affair, but an international event that further divided the political forces in the country and accelerated radicalization. The idea of war came mainly from the so-called Girondins, a group within the National Assembly. They were convinced that a war would stabilize the revolution. On the one hand, they hoped that a victory could spread the revolution in Europe and make France the leading power of progress. On the other hand, they wanted to expose the internal opponents. Anyone who opposes the war must necessarily be an enemy of the revolution. On April 20, 1792, France declared war on Austria. Soon, Prussia also joined Austria, and the coalition of monarchies seemed vastly superior to France. The French army was in a chaotic state. Many officers had left the country, soldiers were poorly trained, and discipline was weak. Even the first campaigns showed that France was hardly a match for the enemy. Defeats at the border increased mistrust in Paris. It was believed that the generals were traitors who deliberately supported the enemies. This climate of fear led to a radicalization of public opinion. Newspapers, clubs, and pamphlets fueled the suspicion that the king and his wife were secretly making a pact with Austria. Marie Antoinette, in particular, was defamed as an Austrian whore who allegedly passed on secret information. Trust in the monarchy, which had already been destroyed after the flight to Varennes, finally collapsed. In the summer of 1792, the tension reached a climax. On June 20th, a large crowd stormed the Tuileries Palace where the king resided. Although Louis remained outwardly unharmed, the message was clear. The people no longer had any respect for the crown. 2 months later, on August 10th, the situation escalated. Sans-culottes and National Guardsmen attacked the Tuileries again. This time, there were bloody battles in which the king's Swiss Guard was almost completely crushed. The king was arrested and taken to prison. This effectively abolished the monarchy. At the same time, the military situation came to a head. The Prussian troops under the Duke of Brunswick advanced on Paris. His manifesto, which threatened to destroy the city if anything happened to the king, had exactly the opposite effect. It mobilized the population even more strongly against the monarchy and the enemies from outside. On 20 September 1792, the Battle of Valmy took place. There, the French Revolutionary Army succeeded in surprisingly repelling the Prussian troops. The victory was rather limited militarily, but psychologically enormous. For the first time, the army of the new France had shown that it could withstand the old European military power. Goethe, who experienced the battle as an observer, is said to have said, "From here and today, a new epoch of world history emanates." One day after Valmy, the National Convention, which now replaced the National Assembly, announced the abolition of the monarchy. On September 21, 1792, France was declared a republic. This was the complete break with the past. But the war remained a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it strengthened the revolutionary spirit and promoted the national idea. On the other hand, it exacerbated internal conflicts. Defeats or setbacks were always explained as betrayal, and the search for internal enemies led to an atmosphere of mistrust and violence. In this mood, the trials against the king were soon to begin, and the reign of terror began. The year 1792 was therefore a year of decision. The war, which was originally intended as a means of consolidating the revolution, accelerated its radicalization and led to the Republic. France entered a new phase in which it was no longer a question of reforms or compromises, but of a fundamental break with the old world.
Chapter 12. The Abolition of the Monarchy. The autumn of 1792 marked one of the most profound turning points of the French Revolution, the final abolition of the monarchy. After centuries in which the crown had been the symbol of the unity and domination of France, the deputies of the National Convention declared on September 21, 1792, that France was henceforth a republic. It was a radical break with the past that shook the country and Europe.
The immediate events inevitably led to this step. The flight to Varennes in the summer of 1791 had destroyed confidence in the king. The uprisings of August 1792 had de facto ended his power, and his arrest in the Tuileries had isolated him politically. Now he stood before the nation as a simple citizen Louis Capet, which no longer recognized him as its ruler. The National Convention, the newly elected representation of the people, was characterized by two major political currents, the Girondins and the Jacobins. The Girondins, rather moderate, wanted to transform the Republic into a stable, liberal order. The Jacobins, on the other hand, led by men like Robespierre, Marat, and Danton, took a more radical line. For them, the monarchy was not just an institution, but a symbol of oppression that had to be completely erased. The war situation reinforced this attitude. Austria and Prussia continued to threaten France, and many revolutionaries saw the king as a potential traitor who was secretly pacifying with the enemies. In this atmosphere, it seemed impossible to preserve the monarchy. The decision was finally made with astonishing clarity. On September 21, just one day after the Battle of Valmy, in which the French army had repelled the coalition, the National Convention voted unanimously for the abolition of the monarchy. It was as if military success had given the revolutionary courage the final boost. France was no longer to be a kingdom, but a republic, the first republic in the country's long history. The proclamation of the republic was an act of enormous symbolic power. It not only turned the political order upside down, but also changed the language and symbols of everyday life. The king was now Citizen Ludwig. The monarchical symbols were removed, and the chronology was soon to be placed on a new basis. In 1793, the revolutionary calendar was introduced, which marked the year 1792 as the Year I of freedom. But the abolition of the monarchy was only the beginning of new conflicts. The question of what to do with the former king divided the nation. Should Louis XVI be put on trial? Was he guilty? And if so, how high should his sentence be? The Girondins pleaded for moderation, some even for a pardon, so as not to provoke Europe any further. The Jacobins, on the other hand, demanded a clear break. The king had to die so that the republic could live. This debate would dominate the coming months and eventually lead to Ludwig's execution. But already in the autumn of 1792, it was clear. France had said goodbye to its past. With the abolition of the monarchy, not only a political system was overthrown, but an entire world. The impact of this decision was enormous. In France itself, it led to euphoria, but also to fear. Euphoria because you had the feeling that you were now really free. Fear because the enemies inside and outside seemed stronger than ever. In the countryside and in the provinces, many people reacted with uncertainty, some even with resistance, as they still felt a bond with the crown. Abroad, the news was a sensation. Monarchs across Europe realized that the revolution was a threat to their own power. The abolition of the monarchy meant that the revolution no longer wanted only internal reforms, but was a universal project that questioned the legitimacy of all kings. This made the fronts in the war even harder, and France soon found itself faced with an ever broader coalition. September 21, 1792 was therefore more than a political date. It was a symbolic new beginning. The Republic was now at the center, and its defense became the top priority. But the coming years were to show how difficult it was to reconcile the ideals of freedom, equality, and fraternity with the realities of war, hunger, and internal conflicts.
Chapter 13. The Execution of Louis XVI. The abolition of the monarchy in September 1792 was a radical step, but the question of what to do with the overthrown king initially remained open. Louis XVI, now officially called Citizen Louis Capet, was imprisoned in the prison of the Temple. His fate was inextricably linked to that of the young republic. If he were to be pardoned, it would have been a sign of weakness for many. If he were to be punished, the question arose, with what measure? The National Convention was forced to initiate proceedings against the former king. The evidence was incriminating. Ludwig was accused of treason, cooperation with foreign powers, and the attempt to sabotage the revolution. Particularly serious was the discovery of an iron cabinet in the Tuileries Palace, in which documents were kept that proved secret contacts and agreements between the king and counter-revolutionary forces. These findings destroyed the last doubts about his loyalty to the nation. The trial began in December 1792, when Ludwig was interrogated before the National Convention, which acted as judge and jury at the same time. He defended himself with dignity, spoke of his love for France, and emphasized that he had never wanted to harm the well-being of the people. But the atmosphere was against him. The majority of the deputies were convinced that the Republic could only exist if a clear cut was made. The debate in the convention was fierce. Girondins and Jacobins were irreconcilably opposed to each other. The Girondins pleaded for leniency, or at least for a referendum on the fate of the king. They feared that his execution would further turn Europe against France and foment a civil war at home. The Jacobins, led by Robespierre, argued that there could be no peace and no republic as long as Louis lived. Ludwig must die so that the republic can live, was Robespierre's famous sentence. On January 15, 1793, the convention voted on the verdict. The decision was close, but the result was clear. Louis XVI was found guilty of high treason. In a second vote, his sentence was decided. With 361 votes for death and 288 against, the verdict was passed. The king was to be executed. The execution was set for 21 January 1793. On the morning of that day, Ludwig was led out of his cell. He wore a white shirt and showed a remarkable calmness. A carriage took him to the Place de la Révolution, the former Place Louis XV, where the guillotine was erected. Tens of thousands of people had gathered to witness the historic moment. Louis mounted the scaffold and tried to speak. "I die innocent," he cried. "I forgive my enemies and hope that my blood may conquer the misfortune of France." But drums drowned out his words so that the crowd would not be stirred up. Shortly afterwards, the guillotine fell. With the death of the king, the fate of the monarchy was sealed. The reactions were different. Many rejoiced because they saw Ludwig's death as a victory of freedom. Others were shocked because the execution of a king was a breach of taboo that Europe had never known before. For the monarchies of Europe, this was a beacon. If France could kill its king, no throne was safe. In fact, the execution led to an escalation of the international situation. Great Britain, Spain, and the Netherlands joined the coalition against France. The war, which had previously been limited to a region, became a pan-European conflict. Internally, the execution led to polarization. For the radicals, it was a necessary step. For many moderate citizens and peasants, a reason for alienation from the revolution. With the death of Louis XVI, the Republic was finally sealed. But it had also entered a stage in which violence and terror became a political reality. The execution of the king was not the end of the crisis, but its beginning. The following years were to show that although the fall of the monarchy had destroyed the old structures, it presented the young republic with unforeseen challenges.
Chapter 14. Robespierre's Reign of Terror. With the execution of Louis XVI in January 1793, the revolution had embarked on an irreversible path. France was now a republic without a king, but the young order was surrounded by enemies. Coalition troops threatened from without, uprisings arose internally, and within the National Convention, various factions struggled for power. It was in this climate of insecurity and violence that what would later go down in history as the Reign of Terror, La Terreur, arose, a phase that is inextricably linked to the name Maximilien Robespierre. Robespierre was not a military leader, not an aristocrat, but a lawyer from Arras who, through his unwavering moral stance and brilliant rhetoric, became the mouthpiece of the radical Jacobins. Early on, he had committed himself to the idea that the Republic could only exist if it was consistently defended, if necessary by force. For him, virtue was the highest principle, and anyone who opposed it was declared an enemy of freedom. The political situation in 1793 was desperate. France was now at war with almost all of Europe. Austria, Prussia, Great Britain, Spain, and the Netherlands had joined forces to fight the revolution. At the same time, uprisings broke out inside. Especially in the West, in the Vendée, peasants rose up against the Republic. They rejected the civil constitution of the clergy, were loyal to the king, and saw the revolutionaries as enemies of their religion. The uprising developed into a bloody civil war. The situation was also tense in Paris itself. The Jacobins faced the Girondins, who followed a more moderate line. In June 1793, there was an open break. Under pressure from the sans-culottes and the Paris Commune, the Girondins were excluded from the National Convention. With this, the Jacobins had taken power. To save the Republic, radical measures were taken. The Welfare Committee, Comité de Salut Public, was created, a kind of emergency government with almost unlimited powers. Robespierre joined this body and soon became its leading figure. Under his leadership, a policy began that relied on total mobilization. Initially, the economy was geared towards war. Price caps on bread and basic foodstuffs were introduced, the army was massively strengthened, and hundreds of thousands of men were drafted. At the same time, the persecution of internal enemies was intensified. Anyone suspected of working against the Republic, whether through words, deeds, or even just silence, could be arrested. The instrument for this was the Revolutionary Tribunal, which was created in March 1793. Here, defendants were often sentenced in summary proceedings. The guillotine, which had been used before, now became the everyday symbol of the revolution. Prominent victims such as Marie Antoinette, who was executed in October 1793, or the Girondin leaders showed that no one was safe. But countless ordinary citizens, priests, nobles, and peasants also fell victim to the terror. Robespierre justified this policy in his speeches. In his famous address of February 1794, he declared, "The foundation of popular government in time of peace is virtue. The basis of popular government in revolutions is at once virtue and terror." For him, terror was not an end in itself, but a necessary means to protect the Republic from its enemies. But the reign of terror went far beyond pragmatic measures. It also had an ideological dimension. Robespierre strove for a republic of virtue in which all citizens would be equal, free, and committed to the common good. In order to realize this vision, new festivals and cults were even created, such as the cult of the Supreme Being, which was supposed to make reason and morality the new belief system. The successes on the battlefields initially proved this policy right. In 1794, the French armies succeeded in repelling the coalition. The victory at Fleurus in June 1794 secured the borders and strengthened the position of the Republic. But it was precisely this military success that made the reign of terror increasingly superfluous. Inside, criticism grew. Many revolutionaries who had once supported Robespierre now feared for their own lives. His uncompromising stance, his willingness to brand even old allies as enemies of the people, isolated him more and more. Eventually, different factions joined forces against him. On July 27, 1794, 9th Thermidor, according to the revolutionary calendar, there was a coup. Robespierre was accused of being a tyrant in the convention. He still tried to make himself heard, but his voice was drowned out in the turmoil. The next day, he was guillotined along with Saint-Just and other followers, ironically by the same instrument he had used so often. With the fall of Robespierre, the reign of terror ended. Thousands of prisoners were released, and the policy of terror was weakened, but the traces of these years remained deep. The terror had shown how a revolution that promised freedom and equality could turn into violence and oppression. The reign of terror remains a controversial chapter to this day. For some, it was a necessary means to save the Republic in an extreme situation. For others, it was a betrayal of the ideals of the revolution. One thing is certain. Without the threat from within and without, Robespierre's policies would hardly have met with so much approval. But when the external danger was averted, terror remained without legitimacy, and thus its architect without support.
Chapter 15. Revolution and Everyday Life. The Life of the People. When we look at the French Revolution, we often think of grand speeches, dramatic votes, and bloody scenes at the guillotine. But apart from these spectacular events, the real life of most people took place in the alleys, markets, and workshops. The revolution was not only a political drama, but also a profound change in everyday life. It influenced how people worked, ate, believed, and interacted with each other. For ordinary people, the supply of food was one of the biggest concerns. Even before 1789, hunger and bread shortages had triggered unrest. During the revolution, the problem remained acute. Price increases, war, and poor harvests exacerbated the situation. In the cities, especially in Paris, people had to queue for hours to get a loaf of bread. Again and again, there was turmoil on the markets when traders were suspected of withholding supplies. The sans-culottes, the urban popular movement, made the bread question a central theme of their politics. Their demand for a fair price was an expression of the struggle for daily survival. But the revolution also brought new forms of control. With the law of the maximum price, loi du maximum, the state tried to regulate the prices of basic stuffs. Traders who violated this had to reckon with harsh penalties. For many, this meant a certain relief, but at the same time it promoted the black market. In the backyards, flour and grain changed hands at high prices, while the authorities tried to keep the supply under control. Everyday life was also shaped by the constant presence of politics. Newspapers, posters, and leaflets were omnipresent. Hardly any citizen could escape the debates that were held in the cafes, workshops, or on the streets. Political affiliation was not an abstract question, but part of daily life. Whether someone wore a cockade in the national colors, whether he appeared in the clubs or at the meetings, all this could determine reputation or suspicion. The revolution also affected family life. Many men were drafted for the war. Women had to cultivate workshops or fields alone. At the same time, women took on new roles in political life. They organized marches, demanded lower bread prices, and performed in the political clubs. Although women's rights were not officially recognized, their commitment made it clear that they were part of the revolution. The famous women's procession to Versailles in October 1789 was only the beginning of a continuous female commitment. Religion, which had long been the center of village and urban life, fell into crisis as a result of the revolution. The civil constitution of the clergy divided the church. Priests who swore the oath to the nation faced those who refused it. For many believers, this was a painful break. Traditional rituals were suppressed or replaced, churches closed or rededicated. In Paris, for example, Notre Dame Cathedral was transformed into a temple of reason. New festivals, such as the Festival of Reason or the Festival of the Supreme Being, were to take the place of the old religion. For many ordinary people, however, this was irritating, even threatening. Religion was an integral part of their everyday lives, and their loss left a void that was not easy to fill. Language and time were also changed. The revolutionary calendar, which was introduced in 1793, was intended to radically detach itself from the past. The year began with the autumn month of Vendémiaire, and the months had names that were based on nature: Brumaire for mist, Germinal for germination. Each month had 30 days, divided into decades of 10 days. Sunday disappeared, and with it the weekly rhythm of work and rest. For many people, this new calendar was an imposition that was difficult to integrate into everyday life. The war also changed everyday life. Paris was far from the battlefields, but the constant fear of invasion and betrayal determined life. Recruitment, mourning for fallen soldiers, and the supply of armies were part of the daily discourse. In the provinces, especially in border areas or in the Vendée, the war was experienced even more directly, where troops marched, battles took place, and entire villages were burned down. But despite all the hardships, there were also moments of joy and community. The revolution brought forth new festivals that were intended to strengthen cohesion. Trees of freedom were erected in public squares to symbolize the new order. National celebrations, which focused on music, dance, and speeches, provided opportunities to experience the new consciousness as citizens. For the people, the revolution meant a mixture of hopes and deprivations, of pride and fear. It profoundly changed everyday life. Work, religion, language, even time itself were reorganized. But at the same time, the daily struggle for bread and security remained. The dream of freedom and equality was omnipresent, but the harsh reality often made it seem distant.
Chapter 16. Women in the Revolution. The French Revolution was an event that radically changed the political and social structures of France. But it was not only the story of kings, politicians, and philosophers. It was also a history of women. From the marches to Versailles to the writings of courageous female authors, women played a central role. They shaped the revolution in many ways, even if their rights remained officially severely restricted. Even at the beginning of the revolution, women appeared as active actors. The famous Women's Procession to Versailles on October 5, 1789, was a decisive moment.
thousands of Parisian women, especially market women, set out to demand bread. With drums, weapons, and an unwavering determination, they forced the king to march to Paris. This action showed that women were not only on the sidelines of events as spectators, but were able to directly influence the course of history. In the everyday life of the revolution, women were often the driving force behind protests. They stood at the markets, were the first to feel the rising bread prices, and organized spontaneous demonstrations. Her role as guardians of the family and providers made her particularly sensitive to economic crises. When hunger became too great, it was usually the women who were the first to take to the streets. In addition, women actively participated in the political culture of the revolution. They attended the debates in the clubs, discussed in the cafes, and founded their own political associations. A well-known example was the Club of Women Revolutionaries, Société des Citoyennes Républicaines Révolutionnaires, which was founded in Paris in 1793. This is where women met to discuss politics, draft resolutions, and demonstrate their presence in public life. The contribution of women writers was particularly impressive. Olympe de Gouges published her Declaration of the Rights of Woman and Citizen, Déclaration des droits de la femme et de la citoyenne, in 1791. In it, she called for equality before the law, access to office, and the right to vote for women. She wrote provocatively, "The woman has the right to climb the scaffold. She must equally have the right to climb the speaker's platform." Their words made it clear that the revolution, which had taken up the cause of freedom and equality, could not ignore half of humanity. But her voice met with fierce resistance. In 1793, Olympe de Gouges was executed for her political writings. Other women also took advantage of the opportunities offered by the revolution. Thérèse de Méricourt, a charismatic activist, spoke at meetings, marched at the head of demonstrations, and became an icon of female participation. However, her radicalism made her the target of enemies who slandered her and brutally attacked her. After her attack, she was taken to hospital and was shortly afterwards committed to an insane asylum. This showed that women's political activity could only happen within the mailbox, if not on her terms. Despite their commitment, women soon reached the limits of male-dominated politics. As early as 1793, the National Convention decided to ban all women's clubs. This was justified by the nature of women, which was supposedly not made for politics. This systematically excluded the female public. Even those women who had carried the revolution on the streets were again marginalized. Nevertheless, the influence of women remained noticeable. In the sans-culottes districts, they were a driving force that exerted pressure on political institutions. Their demands for bread, justice, and strictness towards traitors played a decisive role in shaping the radicalization of the revolution. Even though they did not hold official offices, they had power through their presence, their voices, and their willingness to act. The revolution also brought new debates about the role of women in society. Philosophers and thinkers discussed whether equality could really apply universally. At the same time, new role models emerged. Women who spoke, wrote, or fought in public broke with traditional ideas of femininity. Even if their demands were not implemented immediately, they laid the foundation for later feminist movements. In the provinces and in the countryside, women were also active participants. They took part in uprisings against taxes or conscription, helped to supply the revolutionary troops, and defended their communities. There too, it became clear that the revolution was not just a men's project. But the fate of many of these women was tragic. The revolution promised equality, but denied women political rights. Their demands were often met with harshness, their voices silenced. Nevertheless, her contribution was unmistakable. Without women, the revolution would hardly have developed the dynamics that ultimately shaped it. In retrospect, it becomes clear that the French Revolution was a paradoxical chapter for women. On the one hand, she opened up spaces in which women became visible and active, but on the other, she soon closed these spaces again. But the memory of their deeds remained. The train to Versailles, the writings of Olympe de Gouges, the markets of Paris, all this testifies to the power with which women helped shape the revolution.
Chapter 17: Religion and Revolution. Hardly any other area of French life was so deeply shaken by the revolution as religion. For centuries, the Catholic Church has been not only a spiritual, but also a political and economic power. It owned land, collected tithes from the peasants, and shaped everyday life with festivals, rituals, and moral norms. With the revolution, this order was radically questioned. The relationship between church and state, between faith and politics, changed fundamentally, often accompanied by conflict, violence, and deep divisions. Early on, the revolutionaries made the church the goal of their reforms. In 1789, when the National Assembly abolished the privileges of the estates, the clergy also lost their special rights. In November of the same year, it was decided to nationalize the property of the church. Monasteries, lands, and buildings were expropriated and sold in order to restructure the state finances. This dissolved a centuries-old wealth of the church, a step that unsettled many believers but provided the revolutionary state with enormous resources. Even more drastic was the civil constitution of the clergy of 1790. This law declared that bishops and priests were no longer to be appointed by Rome, but were to be elected by the citizens. They became state officials who had to swear an oath to the nation. For many clergy, this was an intolerable interference with their loyalty to the Pope. A large part of the priests refused to take the oath. One spoke of refractory clergy. This division permeated the entire country. In some villages, the oath priest stood at the altar, while the population secretly sought out the priest who did not take the oath. The consequences were dramatic. Faith, which had hitherto been a unifying bond, now became a source of conflict. Families and congregations broke up over the question of which priest to follow. Especially in rural regions where religion was deeply rooted, this led to resistance. In the Vendée, for example, the uprising against the revolution was closely linked to the defense of the Catholic faith. At the same time, the revolution tried to establish a new form of religiosity. Many revolutionaries were convinced that the church represented not only power, but also superstition and backwardness. It was to be replaced by a religion of reason. In 1793, Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris was declared the Temple of Reason. Festivals of reason were to replace the traditional Catholic celebrations. Statues of freedom and symbols of the Republic adorned church interiors, which were now used for political ceremonies. Robespierre went one step further. In 1794, he introduced the cult of the Supreme Being, a new state-controlled religion that did not deny God but separated him from the church. It was intended to emphasize virtue and morality and bind the people to the values of the Republic. On June 8, 1794, a great festival of the Supreme Being took place in Paris, which Robespierre himself presided. With processions, speeches, and symbolic acts, the people were to experience a new form of spirituality. But many found this cult artificial, even ridiculous, and it helped to further isolate Robespierre. The religious politics of the revolution was thus a constant vacillation between oppression and recreation. While some revolutionaries, such as the Hébertists, were radically anti-clerical and wanted to abolish Christianity altogether, others were looking for a compromise that would reconcile faith and republic. The result, however, was a deep division in society. This situation was difficult to bear for the everyday life of the faithful. The revolutionary calendar, which was introduced in 1793, replaced the 7-day week with a 10-day week. Sunday, traditionally the day of rest, disappeared. Church holidays were abolished or replaced by Republican festivals. For many people, this meant not only a change in the calendar, but a loss of familiar rhythms that had structured their lives. The revolution also changed the relationship between religion and politics in Europe as a whole. Monarchs and popes saw France's anti-ecclesiastical attitude as a threat to their own power. The Pope excommunicated priests who swore the oath and denounced the revolution. Thus, the conflict between Rome and Paris became an international problem that further hardened the fronts in the war. In retrospect, it becomes clear that the religious question was a central area of tension in the revolution. She made it clear how much the claim to freedom and equality collided with the deep-rooted traditions of society. For many people, the republic without religion was unimaginable. For others, it was only possible when the church was disempowered. The French Revolution did not bring a lasting solution to this problem, but it changed the religious landscape of France forever. The power of the church was broken, its role in politics and society severely limited.
At the same time, faith remained a personal foundation for many people that eluded state control. Thus, the religious dimension of the revolution shows a paradox. In an attempt to liberate society, new forms of oppression and new conflicts were created. But it also paved the way for the separation of church and state, which would later become a cornerstone of modern democracy.
Chapter 18. The End of Terror. In the summer of 1794, the revolution had reached a climax, and at the same time, its radical arm, Jacobinism under Robespierre, began to count its last days. The terror that had held France in its grip since 1793 had cost thousands of lives. Guillotines shaped the cityscape of Paris and the provinces. The Revolutionary Tribunal pronounced death sentences almost daily, and mistrust permeated all strata of society. But what had made terror strong, the fear of external enemies and internal betrayal, now began to lose its own basis. In 1794, France was militarily more successful than ever before. The armies of the Republic had repulsed the invading troops, secured the borders, and even conquered territories in Belgium and on the Rhine. The great victory at Fleurus on 26 June 1794 showed that the Republic could survive. This eliminated the central pretext that Robespierre and his followers had used to justify terror as a necessary means of defending the nation. But Robespierre stuck to his policy. What's more, he intensified it. In the spring of 1794, he expanded the definition of the enemy of the people further and further. Not only nobles or royalists, but also former allies, moderate revolutionaries, and even Jacobins themselves were targeted. In April, Danton, once one of the leading minds of the revolution, fell victim to the guillotine. Camille Desmoulins and other moderate voices who had called for an end to the terror also died with him. This harshness increasingly isolated Robespierre. His vision of a republic of virtue, underpinned by the new cult of the supreme being, was met with ridicule and mistrust. On June 8, 1794, at the Great Feast of the Supreme Being, Robespierre appeared in a blue cloak like a high priest. Many members of Parliament felt this was presumptuous and feared that he wanted to elevate himself to dictator. In the convention, the opposition grew. Members of Parliament, fearing for their own lives, began to unite against him. On July 26, 1794, the 9th of Thermidor, according to the revolutionary calendar, the convent rose up against Robespierre. His opponents drowned him out when he tried to speak. "This is the voice of the tyrant," some cried. On the same day, he was arrested, along with his closest followers such as Saint Just and Couthon. During the night, supporters of the Paris Commune tried to free him, but the uprising failed. On July 28, the 10th of Thermidor, Robespierre was guillotined without due process, ironically, by the same instrument that he himself had used so extensively. His death ended the terror abruptly. Thousands of prisoners were released, and the atmosphere of fear gave way to cautious relief. But the end of terror did not immediately mean peace and stability. France remained at war, the economic situation remained precarious, and the political conflicts had not been resolved. But it marked the beginning of a new phase known as the Thermidorian reaction. This period was marked by a setback against the radicals. The power of the Jacobins was broken, their clubs closed, and many of their followers persecuted. In everyday life, there was a real counter-movement. Sans-culottes lost their influence, and wealthier citizens regained the upper hand. The law of the maximum price was repealed, which liberalized the economy but made it more difficult to supply the poor. The political tone changed. Instead of virtue and terror, pragmatism and self-enrichment now dominated. The fall of Robespierre revealed a central dilemma of the revolution. It had promised freedom, equality, and fraternity, but in the name of these ideals, violence had become an everyday tool. As the external threat diminished, terror was no longer justifiable, and its most prominent representative fell. But the question of how the revolution could be continued without violence remained open. Thus, the terror ended not through a deliberate change in the political climate, but through the overthrow of its architect. The revolution had rid itself of its most radical form, but the instability remained. France entered a phase in which power struggles, corruption, and the search for order set the tone.
and in which a new figure was soon to emerge, Napoleon Bonaparte. Chapter 19: The Board of Directors. The Reign of Terror ended with the fall of Robespierre in July 1794, but the revolution was by no means over. France entered a new phase, known as the Thermidorian reaction, and then the time of the Directory. This period lasted from 1795 to 1799 and was marked by political experiments, economic difficulties, social tensions, and the search for a stable order. After the 9th of Thermidor, the country breathed a sigh of relief. The guillotines fell silent, many prisoners were released, and people hoped for normality. But it quickly became clear that the problems had not disappeared. The revolution had overthrown the monarchy and established the republic, but the question of how this republic should be governed was still unresolved. In 1795, a new constitution was passed, which distributed power more strongly among several institutions in order to prevent concentration as under the Jacobins. A strong executive was replaced by a collegial system, the Board of Directors, consisting of 5 directors. These were to conduct the affairs of government and at the same time form a counterweight to the legislature, which consisted of 2 chambers, the Council of 500 and the Council of Elders. The idea was to prevent abuse of power by distributing it on several shoulders. In practice, however, this often led to paralysis and instability. The directors did not always agree, changed frequently, and their authority remained weak. At the same time, the social divide intensified. In the cities, especially in Paris, the sans-culottes had lost their influence. The Thermidorians, mostly wealthier citizens, were no longer interested in radical equality or price regulation. The law of the maximum price was abolished, causing food prices to skyrocket. For the poor, this meant renewed hunger, while traders and wealthy citizens benefited. Sans-culotte uprisings in 1795 and 1796 were severely suppressed, and the popular movement that had carried the revolution for so long lost its political significance. The situation also remained tense in the countryside. The insurrection in the Vendée was contained, but the religious question was not solved. Many people remained hostile to the revolution, especially after the church continued to be severely restricted. The economy was in a desolate state. Inflation, unemployment, and supply crises determined everyday life. The assignats, the paper currency of the revolution, rapidly lost value. Trust in the state was shaken, and corruption spread. The Directory was seen by many as incompetent and selfish, its members as men who enriched themselves while the people suffered. Politically, the period was marked by a constant threat from extremes, both royalists who wanted the monarchy back and Jacobins who demanded a return to radical measures. The Directory maneuvered between these poles, often through repression and election manipulation. A decisive factor in this unstable situation was the military. The Revolutionary Wars continued, and the armies of France achieved impressive successes. Young generals such as Napoleon Bonaparte came forward and drew attention to themselves with their victories. Napoleon ended the royalist uprising in Paris in 1795 with cannons. The famous shot with cannons saved the Directory and made him the man of the moment. In the years that followed, the military successes in Italy and on the Rhine led to an increase in the prestige of the military, while trust in the civilian government continued to decline. The Directory was increasingly dependent on the generals, who not only won wars, but also financed the state by plundering conquered territories and collecting tributes. This dependence on the military was dangerous. The more power the generals received, the weaker the civilian leadership became. Napoleon, who triumphed in Italy and even undertook an expedition to Egypt in 1798, became the nation's hero, far more popular than the anonymous directors in Paris. Domestically, the Directory tried to stabilize the republic, but it did not succeed in creating trust. Corruption, repression against opposition members, and the constant economic crisis led to growing discontent. Many people longed for order, whether through a return to the monarchy or through a strong hand within the republic. The Directory was thus a transitional regime, too weak to permanently secure the gains of the revolution, too strong to disintegrate immediately. It was only maintained by a precarious balance between repression, election fraud, and military support. But this balance could not last.
In 1799, the decisive break finally came. Napoleon returned from Egypt and took advantage of the political crisis to put himself at the top. On 9 November 1799, 18 Brumaire, according to the revolutionary calendar, he staged a coup with the support of the military and ended the rule of the Directory. It was replaced by the Consulate, a new form of government that soon became a personal regime. The board of directors had thus failed. It had neither ended the revolution nor fulfilled its ideals, but it had prepared France for the rise of Napoleon. His weakness cleared the way for a man who promised stability, order, and glory, and who was to lead the revolution into a new imperial phase.
Chapter 20: Napoleon, Legacy and End of the Revolution. With the fall of the Directory in November 1799, a new era began. Napoleon Bonaparte, the young general from Corsica, took power in a cleverly staged coup d'état. What began as a consulate soon developed into personal rule, culminating in the empire. For many, Napoleon was the end of the revolution, but at the same time, he was also their legacy. Without the upheaval since 1789, his rise would hardly have been conceivable. Napoleon knew how to take advantage of the longing for order that prevailed in France after years of uncertainty. The population was tired of inflation, hunger, political struggles, and repression. While the Directory had seemed weak and corrupt, Napoleon embodied drive, discipline, and success. His military victories, especially in Italy, had made him a hero, and he presented himself as a man who could tame the chaos of the revolution while securing its achievements. In the consulate, which existed from 1799 to 1804, Napoleon set the course. He had a new constitution drafted, which sounded officially democratic, but in reality concentrated power in the hands of the first consul, i.e. himself. Plebiscites confirmed his decisions, but they were more political stagings than real votes. As early as 1702, he had himself appointed consul for life, and 2 years later he crowned himself emperor of the French. Despite this authoritarian development, Napoleon made a decisive contribution to the consolidation of the revolution. He created the Code Civil, a code of law that is still considered a milestone today. It guaranteed equality before the law, the abolition of feudal rights, freedom of property, and the separation of church and state. While the code also consolidated the patriarchal order and largely excluded women from political rights, for millions of French people it meant a stable and modern legal system that preserved the achievements of 1789. Napoleon also relied on efficiency and centralization in the administration. He created the prefects, who acted as representatives of the government in the departments, and established a uniform school system that was intended to educate citizens in the interests of the state. In doing so, he created structures that still shape France today. Napoleon was particularly skillful with the church. In 1801, he concluded the Concordat with Pope Pius VII. The Catholic Church was recognized, its role in religious life confirmed, but it remained under state control. In doing so, he resolved one of the deepest conflicts of the revolution. Many believers felt reconciled, while the state retained the upper hand. At the same time, Napoleon continued the revolutionary wars and made France the dominant power in Europe. His armies were victorious in Austerlitz, Jena, and Wagram, conquered large parts of the continent, and spread the principles of the revolution: the abolition of feudalism, the introduction of modern administrations, equality before the law in many countries. For millions of people in Germany, Italy, and Poland, Napoleon's rule meant liberation from old structures, even if it was accompanied by harsh exploitation and the burdens of war. But Napoleon's rule also had its dark sides. Freedom and political participation, which had been among the ideals of 1789, were severely restricted. The press was censored, opposition suppressed, and power was firmly in the hands of the emperor. The people were no longer sovereign, but subject, albeit of a ruler who ruled in the name of the revolution. His urge to expand eventually led to ruin. The Russian campaign of 1812 ended in disaster, and the subsequent defeats decisively weakened France. In 1814, Napoleon was deposed and sent into exile, and in 1815, he was finally defeated in the Battle of Waterloo after his return. With his defeat, the monarchies of Europe returned, and in France, the Bourbon monarchy was restored. But the world was no longer the same as it was in 1789. The revolution and Napoleon had shaken the foundations of old Europe. Even the reinstated kings could no longer completely push back the ideas of equality, civil rights, and nation. Feudalism had been abolished, the church had been disempowered, and the idea of popular sovereignty had become deeply ingrained in society. Napoleon was therefore both the finisher and the funeral leader of the revolution. He secured their social and legal achievements, but he replaced freedom with authority. His empire showed that the longing for order could be stronger than the ideal of democracy. In retrospect, it can be said that the French Revolution was not a straight path from oppression to freedom, but a constant struggle between ideals and realities, between hopes and fears. It brought freedom, equality, and fraternity into the world as universal principles, principles that still have an impact today. Napoleon took these principles out to Europe, even if he often subordinated them to his own glory. So the revolution ended not in Versailles or in the Convention, but on the battlefields of Europe. But their legacy endured. The idea that the people are the sovereign, that all people have equal rights, and that no power remains forever inviolable.